When I slid the 200-page trust modification across the polished mahogany table, my stepbrother Garrick didn't even look at it. He just smiled. It was that slow, symmetrical smirk he'd perfected at Wharton, the one that signaled he'd already spent the money in his head. Across from him, my stepmother, Marin, took a slow, deliberate sip of her vintage Pinot Noir, her manicured fingers leaving a faint grease smudge on the crystal. They believed this was the final act. They believed they had stripped me down to the bone, leaving me with nothing but my biological mother's memory and a useless degree in classical art history. But Benton Vance, their chief legal counsel, wasn't smiling. Vance was a titan in the New York probate circuit, a man who charged $1,500 an hour to bend tax codes until they screamed. He adjusted his gold-rimmed reading glasses, his thumb flicking through the heavy, bonded pages of the irrevocable trust agreement. Everything in the room was silent except for the low, rhythmic hum of the building's HVAC system and the soft rustle of paper. Then, he hit page 142. The silence changed. It became heavy, suffocating. I watched the skin around Vance's jaw go entirely slack. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a camera trick, leaving his complexion the shade of curdled milk. His thumb froze on the margin. He didn't read the next line. He just stared at the fine print, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked hitches. Benton. Marin's voice sliced through the quiet, her sharp, aristocratic tone dropping its polite facade for a fraction of a second. Is there an issue with the signature line? Vance didn't answer her. A single dark bead of sweat broke from his hairline and tracked slowly down his temple, pooling in the crease of his starched white collar. His hands began to tremble, a microscopic vibration that caused the corner of the document to tap against the wood. Asterisk click. 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 Asterisk. He dropped his heavy gold Montblanc pen. It rolled across the table and struck Garrick's silver cufflink with a dull metallic chime. Without uttering a single word, Vance stood up. His knees hit the edge of the table, rattling the crystal glasses. He didn't look at Marin. He didn't look at Garrick. With clumsy, frantic movements, he grabbed his leather briefcase, shoved his yellow legal pad inside, and snapped the brass latches shut. The sound was like two pistol shots in the small room. Benton, what the hell are you doing? Garrick barked, his Ivy League composure finally cracking as he stood up, his chair scraping violently against the herringbone floor. I am withdrawing as counsel for this estate, Vance muttered, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual courtroom authority. He wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the exit sign. Do not call my office. Do not contact my associates. Our retainer is terminated as of this second. He turned and practically sprinted toward the heavy glass doors, his leather soles squeaking on the marble foyer outside until the sound died in the elevator bank. He wasn't just resigning. He was fleeing a federal paper trail that led straight to a penitentiary. I sat perfectly still in my simple black dress, the fabric rough against my knees. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched them. The world is obsessed with cheap revenge stories, the kind where a wronged daughter throws a drink in a ballroom or screams her lungs out in a courtroom. But real power doesn't make noise. Real power is forensic. It sits in a leather chair, counts the breaths of its enemies, and lets them tie their own noose with 30-pound bond paper. To understand how we arrived at this boardroom on the 52nd floor, you have to understand the sheer suffocating weight of the last 12 months. Today was June 7th. Exactly 1 year to the day since my father's heart stopped beating in a private wing at New York Presbyterian. He hadn't even been cold before the vultures began their inventory. Marin had married my father 6 years ago, bringing her son Garrick into our lives like an invasive species. They didn't use fists or crude insults. Their cruelty was entirely bureaucratic, wrapped in a suffocating layer of high society politeness. They spent a year treating me like an unwanted tenant in my own life, slowly chipping away at my access to the family enterprise, changing the security codes at the Southampton estate, and rewriting the narrative of my father's final days to make me look like an estranged, unstable liability. They were the ultimate greedy heirs, the kind who viewed every dollar spent on someone else as a personal theft against their birthright. Signe, darling, Marin said now, her voice smoothing back out into that venomous, soft purr as she looked across the empty space Vance had just left. I don't know what kind of pathetic legal theatrics you've attempted here, but it changes nothing. The probate judge already reviewed the primary schedule. You are out. She leaned forward, the scent of her expensive Chanel No. 5 cutting through the smell of old paper. Let's be entirely transparent. You don't have the stomach for this world. Your father knew it. We know it. You belong in a small gallery somewhere, playing with your little paintings, not managing a multi-tiered real estate trust. We are offering you a clean exit. Take the $50,000 annual annuity, sign the waiver, and you can go back to Europe. If you don't. She paused, a thin razor-sharp smile touching her lips. Garrick will release the medical filings. Garrick reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy cream envelope, sliding it across the table until it rested right in front of my hands. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was inside. A meticulously forged psychiatric evaluation from a corrupt clinic in Connecticut, suggesting I suffered from severe delusional paranoia and was incapable of managing my own affairs. It was a threat of public guardianship, a promise to lock me in a legal cage until my father's entire $60 million legacy was thoroughly digested by their greed. They thought they had me in a corner. They thought the cold, isolated girl in the black dress was about to break. They didn't realize that for 365 days, I had been documenting every transaction, every offshore wire, and every signature they had forced my dying father to execute. They thought they were the predators and I was the meat. They had no idea the trap had already sprung. Garrick remained frozen, his arm still extended toward the empty space where his elite counsel had stood seconds before. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom were still settling into their frames, the faint hiss of the hydraulic hinges sounding like a dying breath. Marin's glass remained halfway to her lips, her knuckles white against the stem. For 3 seconds, the 52nd floor of the tower was completely devoid of human sound. Then the mask went back on. Marin set her wine down with a controlled, deliberate click. She looked at her son, a sharp, silent command passing between her cold blue eyes and his. Garrick swallowed, adjusting his tie, his chest expanding as he forced his Wharton-bred confidence back into his spine. He looked at me, his lip curling into that familiar patrician sneer. Benton has been working 80-hour weeks, Garrick said, his voice flat, trying to smooth over the jagged edges of what we had just witnessed. The man is clearly having a midlife collapse. If you think a lawyer's panic attack changes the statutory reality of your father's estate, Signe, you are more detached from reality than we thought. Garrick is right, darling, Marin chimed in, her voice dropping an octave into that practiced, soft register she used when she was delivering a lethal blow. She leaned back, smoothing the front of her tailored ivory blazer. Let's not get distracted by the hired help. The paperwork in front of you is a formality. You are done here. You have been done for months. She wasn't lying about the timeline. They had been dismantling my life piece by piece, using the cold, heavy machinery of the New York legal system to starve me out long before my father's body was even cold. It started 3 weeks after the funeral. I went to use my corporate debit card at a local supplier in Brooklyn to purchase linen canvases for my studio. The transaction was declined. Code 04. Pickup card. I called Citibank's private wealth division, assuming it was a routine fraud alert. The representative's voice on the other end was polite, sterile, and entirely indifferent. Asterisk, I'm sorry, Ms. Vance, but you're signing authority on the family office. Operating accounts was revoked yesterday afternoon via an ex parte probate filing. Your name has been removed from the signature cards. Asterisk, an ex parte motion. A legal ambush. They had gone before a surrogate judge in Westchester County, a judge whose re-election campaign had been quietly funded by Marin's shell companies, and argued that my emotional distress over my father's death made me a liability to the family's commercial real estate portfolio. They didn't notify me. They didn't have to. Under New York probate law, if you can prove an emergency asset drain, a judge can sign a temporary restraining order without the other party even being in the room. Within 48 hours, my entire existence was systemically frozen. My car, a modest Volvo my father had bought me for my 25th birthday, was registered under the corporate holding company, Vance Logistics LLC. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I woke up to the sound of a hydraulic lift. I looked out my window to see a flatbed tow truck hoisting my car into the air. A man in a high-visibility vest handed me a laminated notice signed by Garrick. The lease had been terminated for corporate asset optimization. Then came the eviction. The small loft apartment in Dumbo where I lived and worked wasn't mine. It belonged to a subsidiary of my father's primary firm. I received a formal notice to quit, taped to my door, giving me exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises due to imminent structural renovations. When I called the building manager, a man who had known my father for 20 years, a man whose daughter's college tuition my father had quietly paid, he wouldn't take my call. His secretary sounded terrified. Mr. Rossi is in a meeting, Ms. Vance. He says all communications must go through Vance and Associates. Please don't call here again. They had isolated me completely. They cut off my cell phone line, which was part of the family's enterprise plan. They shut down my health insurance in the middle of a dental procedure, leaving me with a $4,000 bill I couldn't pay. They even contacted the small gallery in Chelsea that represented my art, subtly hinting that if they continued to exhibit my work, the Vance Foundation would permanently withdraw its six-figure annual corporate sponsorship from the gallery's winter gala. The message was clear: submit or starve. But the deepest, most agonizing cut wasn't the car, the apartment, or the money. It was the Rosewood Children's Trust. My biological mother, Rose, had spent the last 10 years of her life building that foundation. It was a small, fiercely protected nonprofit that funded art therapy programs for pediatric oncology wards across the state. My father had promised her on her deathbed that the endowment would remain untouched, a perpetual legacy of her grace. When she died, I took over as the chair of the board. It was my anchor, my only remaining connection to the woman who gave me my eyes and my quiet nature. 4 months ago, I arrived at the foundation's office in Long Island City to find the locks changed. A security guard from a private firm stood outside the glass door, his arms crossed over his chest. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes scanning my faded denim jacket. "I'm Signe Vance. I'm the chairperson," I said, my hand reaching for the door handle. He didn't move. He pulled a folded document from his belt and handed it to me. It was a corporate resolution. Marin, using her newly appointed seat as majority trustee of my father's primary estate, had executed a hostile restructuring of the foundation's board. They had liquidated the endowment, rolling the $12 million of charity funds back into the family's core real estate holding company to cover a bad commercial debt Garrick had incurred in New Jersey. The art supplies, the specialized computers for the sick children, the salaries of the 3 social workers who had been with my mother for a decade, all deleted with a single stroke of a pen. I called Marin that night, my voice shaking, tears finally breaking through my defenses. "Marin, please," I begged, hating myself for the weakness in my voice. "Take the properties. Take the townhouse. But leave Rosewood alone. Those kids. They have nothing else." I could hear the ice cubes clinking against her glass on the other end of the line. The background noise of her penthouse was filled with the soft jazz of a private dinner party. "Signe, sweetie," she had said, her tone dripping with a terrifying maternal condescension. "Sentimentality is a luxury the market simply doesn't support right now. Your mother's little hobby project was hemorrhaging cash on administrative overhead." Garrick looked at the tax returns. "It was a joke. We've simply reallocated those funds to a much more stable, tax-efficient vehicle. You should be thanking us for cleaning up her sloppy bookkeeping." "It wasn't sloppy," I whispered, my chest tightening until I could barely breathe. "It was her life." "Well, her life is over," Marin said, her voice dropping the warmth instantly, turning sharp as a razor blade. "And yours is about to become very difficult if you keep making these tiresome phone calls. Grow up, Signe. The world belongs to people who know how to manage capital, not people who paint feelings on canvas." She hung up. That was the moment something died inside me. And that was the moment something far more calculated was born. Now, sitting across from them in this high-altitude tomb of a boardroom, I watched Garrick pick up the heavy cream envelope he had slid toward me earlier. He tapped it against his palm, his eyes boring into mine with a malicious intensity. "Let's get back to the reality of today," Garrick said, his voice dropping into a hard dictatorial rhythm. "This envelope contains a certified copy of a psychiatric evaluation from the Silver Hills Institute. It states in very precise clinical language that you have been suffering from severe, unmanageable manic-depressive episodes since your father's passing. It documents instances of public instability, including your pathetic little scene at the Rosewood offices. We have 3 prominent doctors ready to swear to it in a guardianship hearing next Monday, Marin added, her hands folded neatly on the table. If you do not sign this trust modification today, giving up all residual claims to the primary estate, we will file for an involuntary legal guardianship. We will take control of your medical decisions, your living arrangements, and whatever tiny personal assets you have left. You will be declared legally incompetent before the sun sets on Tuesday. She leaned closer, her eyes glittering with the absolute thrill of total dominance. Think about how that will look in the New York Times, Signe. The tragic, unhinged daughter of the Vance Empire, locked away for her own protection. Who do you think the public will believe? A girl with an art degree and a history of tears? Or the board of directors of a $60 million corporation? The cruelty was absolute. It was a complete, systemic execution of a human being's autonomy, performed under the bright fluorescent lights of a corporate office, wrapped in the language of medicine and law. They had taken my car. They had taken my home. They had erased my mother's charity. Now they were preparing to take my very name, locking me in a psychological cage from which I would never emerge. Anyone else would have broken. Anyone else would have screamed or begged, or signed the paper just to make the nightmare stop. The invisible audience watching this story unfold from behind the glass walls of reality would be screaming for blood, begging for a bolt of lightning to strike these 2 monsters down where they sat. But I didn't move a muscle. I kept my breath steady, counting the seconds between my heartbeats. Asterisk 1, 2, 3. Asterisk. I looked at the cream envelope. I looked at Marin's perfect, expensive smile. I looked at Garrick's arrogant, Wharton-molded jawline. They thought they had backed me into the ultimate corner. They thought they were looking at a broken girl who had run out of options. They didn't realize that every single move they had made over the last 12 months had been exactly what I needed them to do. They had followed the script I had laid out for them with absolute, predictable obedience. Their arrogance had made them blind, and their greed had made them stupid. You're right, I said softly, my voice clear and completely devoid of fear. I reached out and touched the edge of the trust agreement. Let's be entirely transparent. I let my chin drop toward my chest, letting the heavy weight of my dark hair fall forward to screen my face. It was an old theater trick. Give the predator the physical confirmation of their victory, and their critical faculties immediately go offline. My hands, resting flat against the cold mahogany, trembled with a practiced, subtle vibration. Garrick leaned forward, his chest pressed against the edge of the table, his nostrils flaring slightly as he inhaled the scent of my apparent surrender. To a man like him, an Ivy League sociopath trained to spot vulnerability like a shark smells blood, this was the ultimate high. He wanted to see me break. He needed it to validate the absolute righteousness of his greed. I need 72 hours, I whispered, keeping my voice raw, letting the words catch dryly against the back of my throat. I didn't look up. 3 days. Just to clear out the remaining inventory from my mother's old studio space in Long Island City. There are personal sketches. Things the foundation didn't liquidate. Let me have those and I will sign the waiver on Thursday morning. I won't contest the guardianship. I won't file the counterpetitions. I'll take the annuity and leave the state immediately. I have no strength left. Garrick let out a short, wet snort of derision, turning his head to look at his mother. The probate court opens at 9 tomorrow morning, Signe. We don't adjust the corporate calendar for a box of drawings. But Marin raised a single manicured hand, her heavy diamond ring catching the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom. She was a different kind of animal than her son. She understood that a cornered rat might bite if pushed too fast, but a rat offered a small escape hatch will run straight into the cage. Let her have until Thursday, Garrick, Marin said, her soft, venomous purr returning with absolute calm. What is 72 hours when we have already waited a fiscal year? Let her gather her sentimental trash. It saves us all disposal costs. They thought they were granting a final, pathetic mercy to a defeated girl. They had no idea that every tick of the clock was a calculated metric in my own timeline. 2 weeks ago, long before this ambush was called, I had been standing in the subterranean vault of the Wells Fargo branch on Lex, surrounded by rows of brushed steel boxes. Martha, the head vault teller who had known my father since his first commercial real estate acquisition in 1984, didn't ask me for corporate resolutions. She looked at my face, verified my biometric signature on the digital pad, and turned her master key alongside my father's duplicate vault key. Deposit Box 814. Inside that cold steel box lay the architecture of their total destruction. It wasn't a handwritten apology or a secret second will. It was a SanDisk encrypted flash drive and 3 certified copies of Form 1040X, amended federal tax returns from 3 fiscal years prior. My father hadn't been blind to Marin's slow, systemic infiltration of the family firm. When the cancer began to cloud his bones, he didn't hire a flashy law firm that Marin could easily buy off. He hired Miller. Miller was a 60-year-old retired special agent from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, a man who spent 3 decades tracking the hidden bloodlines of dirty money through complex global banking systems. Miller had spent 6 months working from a windowless basement apartment in Queens, analyzing every wire transfer Garrick had executed under the guise of asset reallocation. What my father and Miller discovered was a goldmine of financial suicide. Garrick, in his desperate haste to fund his disastrous commercial development projects in New Jersey, had moved $40 million out of the domestic trust and routed it through a shell company called Lucent Holdings SA, a paper entity registered to a post office box in Luxembourg. He had masked the transfers as legitimate intercompany loans, entirely failing to file specific Form 8938 or report the foreign accounts under the Federal Bank Secrecy Act. Every 100 words of my father's private log on that drive laid out the trap with mathematical precision. Garrick thought he was a financial genius who had bypassed the tax code. He didn't understand the heavy, merciless weight of Section 6901 of the Internal Revenue Code. The statute governs transferee liability. In plain, harsh American law, it means that if an estate or trust owes back taxes, interest, and fraud penalties to the federal government, the liability doesn't vanish when the assets are transferred to the heirs. The IRS simply follows the money. They attach the debt directly to the new trustees who assume total executive control of the assets. And the Lucent Holdings transfers weren't just a matter of sloppy bookkeeping. They constituted completely deliberate, criminal tax evasion. Miller had already delivered the full unredacted, highly secret forensic audit to the IRS whistleblower office under an anonymous filing code. The total back taxes, combined with the civil fraud penalties which carry a mandatory 75% assessment under Section 6663, stood at $75 million. That was $15 million more than the entire gross valuation of the Vance family estate. The trust they were so violently trying to steal from me wasn't a fortune at all. It was a ticking financial radioactive core. "Thank you," I said softly, standing up from the mahogany table with a slow, deliberate clumsiness. I reached down, gathering my cheap canvas tote bag, letting the strap slip from my fingers once before catching it. I needed them to see a girl who had lost her grip, someone whose spirit had been thoroughly crushed by the weight of their corporate machinery. Garrick watched me with an expression of pure triumph, his fingers idly twisting the heavy gold Montblanc pen that Benton Vance had abandoned in his panic. He didn't even notice that Vance's sudden departure had left a gaping hole in their legal front. He assumed the old man had simply succumbed to the stress of the very long hours. "Thursday at 10, Signe," Marin said, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. She didn't stand up. She didn't offer a hand. She just watched me walk toward the heavy glass doors, her eyes cold, calculating the future value of the properties she believed she now owned completely. "Have your own signature ready. My associates will have the very final surrogate documents waiting for you. Don't be late. We have a closing on a Manhattan penthouse at noon sharp." I didn't answer. I pushed through the glass doors, the heavy hydraulic hinges giving that faint, dying hiss behind me. I walked down the long travertine corridor toward the elevator bank, my low heels striking the stone in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Click, click, click. I stepped into the mirrored elevator cab, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors slide shut, sealing Marin and Garrick into their temporary kingdom on the 52nd floor. The descent was fast, dropping my stomach into my shoes as the elevator plummeted through the core of the skyscraper. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the thick, humid New York summer air hit me like a physical wall, stripping away the sterile air-conditioned scent of their corporate greed. I walked 3 blocks down Lexington Avenue, ducking into a greasy spoon diner that smelled of burnt coffee. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket, dialed a Washington area code and waited. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "They took the timeline," I whispered, the trembling weakness completely gone from my tone. On the other end, Miller let out a low, grim chuckle. "Perfect. The trap is set." The 72 hours that followed were a masterclass in American corporate hubris. While I sat in the dim, turpentine-scented air of my mother's abandoned studio in Long Island City, Garrick and Marin were already celebrating their victory at the Baccarat Hotel on West 53rd. I know this because Miller had a compliance runner sitting 3 tables away, watching them order $200 flutes of Dom Perignon. They weren't just drinking to the acquisition of my father's $60 million legacy. They were already spending it. Arrogance is a specific kind of blindness. It makes smart people do incredibly reckless things because they assume their targets are too broken to fight back. Garrick's fatal mistake began at noon on Tuesday, exactly 48 hours before our scheduled final signing. He couldn't wait. The commercial real estate debt he had accumulated from his failed logistics venture in Paramus, New Jersey, was pressing hard against his ribs. The lenders were circling. He needed a massive infusion of liquid capital to keep his personal credit lines from collapsing into default. Instead of waiting for the formal probate court clearance on Thursday, Garrick took the unsigned draft copy of the irrevocable trust agreement and went straight to Vanguard Capital, a hard-money boutique lender known for charging predatory interest rates on short-term bridge financing. He needed $5 million immediately to secure the non-refundable deposit on a $12 million duplex penthouse overlooking Central Park West. Marin had her heart set on it. She wanted the penthouse to signal her ascension to the absolute peak of Manhattan high society. To secure that $5 million bridge loan, Garrick had to provide collateral. A normal, seasoned trustee would never expose personal assets to back a corporate bridge loan before the main estate was settled. But Garrick was blinded by the glare of his own reflected brilliance. He convinced Vanguard's underwriting committee that the Vance Trust was 99% secure, pointing to the psychiatric leverage they held over me. He didn't just pledge the future assets of the trust, he signed a personal guarantee. He used his and Marin's current Fifth Avenue townhouse and their private liquid brokerage accounts as cross-collateralization. If the trust failed to clear on Thursday, the hard money lenders had the legal right to seize everything they currently owned. It was a financial suicide pact wrapped in a Tom Ford suit. And why didn't their legal counsel stop them? Because Benton Vance's sudden, panicked flight on Monday had left a vacuum. A cautious executive would have paused. A prudent man would have hired a top-tier white shoe firm like Skadden or Sullivan and Cromwell to conduct an immediate, exhaustive review of the files Vance had abandoned. But Garrick's ego couldn't tolerate the delay. He didn't want a brilliant lawyer asking hard questions about Lucent Holdings SA or the Luxembourg wire transfers. He didn't want anyone looking too closely at the books. Instead, Garrick hired Todd Albright. Albright was a 38-year-old senior associate at a mid-tier firm on Madison Avenue, a man who had spent his career chasing billable hours and desperate for a break into the big leagues. When Garrick offered him a $50,000 retainer just to oversee a routine trust modification and a bridge loan closing, Albright didn't ask questions. He didn't perform due diligence. He didn't pull the underlying federal tax lien registries, and he certainly didn't check the foreign asset disclosure logs with the Treasury Department. He saw the name Vance, he saw the $60 million asset schedule, and he smelled the scent of a permanent $1 million corporate client. "The paperwork is pristine, Garrick," Albright had told him during a speakerphone call that Miller's source intercepted on Tuesday afternoon. Albright's voice was filled with the eager, sycophantic hunger of a second-rate professional. "Vance's draft is tight. Once Signe signs the waiver on Thursday morning, the surrogate court will clear the distribution within 24 hours. Vanguard's bridge loan is perfectly safe. You can sign the penthouse contract at noon." Garrick didn't hesitate. He sat in the Baccarat lounge, dipped his pen in blue ink, and signed both the bridge loan and the binding, non-refundable purchase agreement for the Central Park penthouse. He authorized the immediate transfer of his remaining private cash reserves, the money he had stolen from the Rosewood Children's Trust, to the real estate escrow agent as a good faith deposit. They were officially locked in. They had tied their entire personal financial survival to a toxic legal entity that was already being tracked by federal criminal investigators. Meanwhile, I spent Tuesday afternoon packing old, dusty cardboard boxes in Long Island City. The studio was hot, the humidity thick enough to make the air feel wet against my skin. My fingers were gray with charcoal dust and old graphite. I wasn't looking at my mother's sketches. I was staring at a cheap Lenovo laptop perched on a rusted metal stool, watching the live digital ledger of the Vance Core operating account. At 3:14 p.m., the notification flashed on my screen. A wire transfer of $4,200,000 had been initiated by Garrick Vance, managing trustee, routed directly to the escrow account of the Manhattan luxury developer. I picked up the burner phone and called Miller. He answered on the first ring. The background noise on his end was the loud, metallic clatter of the subways near the Federal Building on Foley Square. "He bit," I said. My voice was steady, cold, completely devoid of the shaky, broken cadence I had used in the boardroom 24 hours earlier. "I see it on the terminal," Miller replied, his dry, gravelly voice carrying a trace of grim satisfaction. "The idiot didn't even use a protected corporate shield for the bridge loan. He signed the personal guarantee. He put his own house on the block to buy a piece of sky before he even had the deed." "What about the IRS?" I asked, my hand tightening around the plastic casing of the phone. "The revenue agents just finalized the jeopardy assessment under Section 6861, Miller said. I could hear him shifting a stack of heavy paper documents on his desk. Because of the foreign wire transfers to Luxembourg and the clear risk of asset flight, the district director signed off on an immediate freeze order. They aren't waiting for Thursday afternoon, Signe. The moment that trust modification is signed and filed, the federal government is going to drop a lien on every asset connected to that trust, including any accounts that have been cross-collateralized by the trustees." Garrick didn't just walk into the trap. He welded the door shut behind him. I looked down at an old, unfinished oil painting my mother had left on the easel 20 years ago. A simple, vibrant landscape of the Montauk coast, filled with bright blues and deep greens. It was the only thing of value left in this room. Marin had called her work a joke. She had called her life a failure of capital management. "He thinks he's a predator, Miller?" I whispered, my eyes tracking the rough, textured brushstrokes of my mother's hand. "They always do," Miller muttered. "Until the red ink hits the ledger. I'll see you at the office on Thursday morning at 9:30. Dress light, kid. It's going to be a very long day in that room." I closed the laptop, placed it carefully inside my canvas tote bag, and walked out into the gray industrial corridor of the warehouse. The air outside was turning purple as the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the East River. The skyscrapers across the water looked like giant, silver teeth cutting into the clouds. For 12 months, those buildings had felt like a prison wall, a monument to the money and power that had crushed my father and erased my mother's legacy. But as I walked toward the subway station, my heels hitting the pavement in that slow, unbreakable rhythm, the city didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a crime scene, and the perpetrators were currently ordering another bottle of champagne, completely unaware that their clock had just run out of seconds. Thursday morning arrived with the heavy, bruised sky of a typical New York summer rainstorm. At exactly 9:58 a.m., I walked through the double glass doors of the 52nd floor boardroom. I didn't wear denim today. I wore a charcoal gray tailored sheath dress. Simple, sharp, unadorned. No jewelry. No makeup except for a swipe of pale lipstick. I looked like a woman who had spent the last 3 days crying in a dark room. I looked exactly like the victim they wanted to bury. Marin and Garrick were already seated at the mahogany table, flanked by their new legal champion, Todd Albright. Marin wore deep emerald silk today, the color of old money and unearned victories. Garrick was tapping a thick stack of blue-backed legal documents against his palm, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack sounding like a miniature guillotine. To my left sat Marcus Vance, a conservative, gray-haired surrogate court referee appointed by the state to witness the formal execution of the trust modification. The air in the room was dense with the scent of expensive espresso and predatory triumph. "You're late, Signe," Garrick said, his voice clipped, his eyes tracking my canvas tote bag with a look of profound disgust. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't offer me a glass of water. The Vanguard Capital closing team is on standby in the lower conference room. We have exactly 20 minutes to file these executed waivers with the court clerk downstairs before the Manhattan penthouse deposit expires. Let's just get this over with, I muttered, keeping my pitch low, tentative. I pulled out a chair at the far end of the table, deliberately choosing the position farthest from the window, looking small against the massive backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. Todd Albright slid the heavy bound folders toward me. His fingers were thick, his gold signet ring flashing as he tapped the signature lines marked with small, yellow adhesive arrows. "Ms. Vance," Albright said, his voice carrying that eager, unearned authority of a man who thought he had just secured a multi-million-dollar corporate client. "These are the final, unconditional waivers of interest. By signing here you irrevocably relinquish all current and future claims to the executive management of the Vance Irrevocable Trust. You also stipulate that you waive the right to contest the pending adult guardianship petition filed by your stepmother." "And the annuity?" I asked, looking directly at Marin. My voice held a slight, calculated tremor. Marin offered a small, grandmotherly smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. "The $50,000 will be wired to your designated account on the first of every month, sweetie. Assuming, of course, you remain outside the tri-state area as agreed. We simply want you to be safe and quiet." I looked down at the paper. I picked up the heavy gold Montblanc pen that Garrick had shoved into my hand. My fingers didn't shake. Not anymore. This was the absolute pinnacle of what the legal trade calls malicious compliance. They wanted the trust? They wanted the absolute power that came with it? I was going to give it to them. Every single bit of it. I pressed the gold nib to the paper. The blue ink flowed smoothly across the heavy white bond. My signature sharp and clean. Signe Rose Vance. I flipped the page. Signed again. 3 times. 4 times. I signed away the properties. I signed away the townhouse. I signed away every legal right my father had left me in the open sunlight of his primary will. The moment my pen left the final page, Garrick practically lunged across the table. He snatched the folders away from me with a raw, desperate hunger that was almost pathetic to witness. "Finally," he breathed, his Ivy League polish completely evaporating as his eyes scanned my signature. He turned to the court referee. "Marcus, verify the biometrics. Let's get this stamped." Garrick didn't wait for the referee. He took his own pen and signed the trustee acceptance lines with heavy, violent strokes. He passed the folders to Marin. She signed her name with an elegant, looping script, her diamond rings clinking against the mahogany table. It was done. The signatures were dry. The trap had officially snapped. Marcus Vance, the court referee, took the documents, aligned them precisely, and struck them with his heavy steel notary seal. The loud, metallic clack echoed through the silent boardroom like a gavel dropping in a criminal court. "All right," Garrick said, standing up, his chest swelling as he reached for his phone to call the hard money lenders at Vanguard Capital. "Albright, get these files down to the clerk. Let's release the bridge loan." "Wait," Todd Albright said. The word was small, but it caught in the back of his throat. He had turned the page to verify the court referee's seal, but his eyes had locked onto a document that had been bound directly behind the final signature page. A document printed on the distinct, thin green paper used exclusively by the federal government. "Garrick, hold on a second," Albright whispered. His voice had suddenly lost its sycophantic warmth. It sounded thin, brittle. "What is it, Todd?" Garrick barked, his phone already halfway to his ear. "We don't have time for a typo check." Albright didn't answer him. He was staring at page 142. His thumb was frozen on the margin, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. I watched the skin along his jawline tighten, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches. A single bead of sweat broke from his temples, tracking slowly down through his expensive sideburns and pooling in the collar of his shirt. "What the hell is that?" Garrick demanded, stepping around the table, his hand reaching out to grab the folder. Albright didn't let him take it. He stood up slowly, his knees hitting the edge of the table, causing Marin's crystal water glass to rattle against the wood. He looked at me, his eyes wide, completely dilated with a sudden, overwhelming terror. He looked like a man who had just opened a closet door and found a bomb ticking inside. "Marcus," Albright said, his voice trembling as he addressed the court referee, completely ignoring his own client. "What is the filing date on this attachment?" The referee looked down at his digital ledger. "The attachment was processed via the Federal Electronic Registry at 9:01 a.m. this morning, Mr. Albright. It was automatically integrated into the estate's corporate bylaws as an overriding statutory lien. It is legally binding on all successor trustees upon execution of management." Albright turned back to Garrick, his face the color of wet chalk. His hand shook so violently that the heavy document slipped from his fingers, fluttering onto the polished mahogany table with a soft, definitive rustle. "You didn't perform the due diligence, Garrick," Albright whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "You told me the asset schedule was clean. You told me it was just a routine family dispute." "It is a routine dispute," Garrick roared, slamming his hand onto the table. "What are you talking about?" "Read it," Albright choked out, stepping back from the table, his hands raised as if the paper were hot to the touch. "Page 142. It's a jeopardy assessment notice from the Internal Revenue Service. Criminal Investigation Division. They've frozen the entire core trust for fraudulent foreign transfers under Section 6901. And because you just signed the unconditional successor trustee acceptance, you and your mother just personally ratified the debt." Garrick ripped the green parchment from Albright's fingers. His eyes scanned the layout, his jaw tightening as he tried to process the dense prose. "This is absurd," he stammered, his arrogance struggling against the cold reality of the seal. "A tax lien? On an estate of this size? Albright, fix this. Call the director. Use the Vance funds to kill this narrative right now before it ruins our names." Albright didn't move toward his phone. Instead, he shoved his laptop into his leather briefcase with uncoordinated haste. "There is no fixing this, Garrick," Albright whispered, his voice cracking. "A jeopardy assessment under Section 6861 means the IRS has already determined that asset flight is imminent. They freeze first and litigate later. And because you signed that unconditional successor trustee acceptance, you legally assumed the identity of the primary tax debtor." I stood up slowly, the calculated tremor entirely gone from my limbs. I smoothed down my charcoal dress, looking at the two monsters who had spent 12 months trying to erase my existence from my late father's house. "He's right, Garrick," I said, my voice cutting through the panic like a winter wind across the Hudson. "Let's do the forensic math your Wharton professors forgot to teach you. The core trust holds $60 million. But the Lucent Holdings wires you routed through Luxembourg over the last 3 years constituted deliberate tax evasion. Miller and I handed the complete foreign account logs to the IRS 3 months ago." Marin's glass slipped from her hand, striking the edge of the mahogany table and shattering into shards. The dark red wine pooled across the contract, bleeding into her fresh signature. You pathetic little bitch," she hissed, her aristocratic mask completely disintegrating, leaving only the raw, ugly features of a trapped predator. "You think you can destroy us with a piece of paper?" "It's not just a piece of paper, Marin," I said, leaning forward, resting my palms flat on the cool wood. "It's $75 million in back taxes, compounded interest, and a mandatory 75% civil fraud penalty under Section 6663. The debt exceeds the value of the trust by $15 million. The Vance Trust is no longer a fortune. It is a ticking radioactive core." Garrick's phone began to vibrate violently against the wood. The screen read Vanguard Capital. He stared at it, his thumb hovering over the flashing glass, paralyzed by a terror he had never felt before, completely terrified to answer. "Go ahead, pick it up," I murmured, my voice deadly calm. "That's Vanguard Capital. They just received the automated Federal Registry alert. Since you signed a personal guarantee using your Fifth Avenue townhouse and private brokerage accounts as cross-collateralization for that penthouse bridge loan, the IRS lien just attached to your personal assets too. By noon, Vanguard will declare a technical default, seizing your townhouse and forfeiting your deposit. You aren't just broke, Garrick. You are completely wiped out. This is fraud," Garrick screamed, his voice reaching a high, frantic pitch as he lunged toward Todd Albright, his hands clenching into tight fists. "Albright, protect us. We pay your firm a $50,000 retainer. Albright snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut. The double clack sounded like a final judgment. He didn't look at them. He looked only at the exit. I am not your counsel, Albright said, his voice cold. If I remain in this room, the Department of Justice will view me as an accessory to asset concealment. Good luck, Garrick. Don't call my cell. He turned on his heel and practically ran from the room, his leather soles squeaking frantically across the travertine floor until the glass doors closed behind him. He didn't just resign. He fled the wreckage of their lives. Marin fell back into her leather chair, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her hands clawed at her throat, her emerald silk blouse suddenly looking like a shroud. Signe. Please, she whimpered, her voice dropping the venom, replacing it with the weeping cadence of a woman who had lost everything. Your father wouldn't want this. We are family. My father knew exactly what you monsters were, I said, looking down at her with absolute clinical indifference. He left the breadcrumbs. Just showed the federal government where to look. You wanted his legacy? You have it. Every single cent of his debt belongs to you now. I picked up my canvas tote bag, slinging it over my shoulder. I didn't look back. I didn't need to hear Garrick's frantic screams into his phone, or watch Marin slide down onto the floor, her manicured nails scratching helplessly at the expensive mahogany table. I walked out of the boardroom, my low heels striking the stone in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Click, click, click. The sound echoed in the empty hall. They thought they had left me with nothing. But real intelligence always keeps a private reserve. My father's $60 million estate was a toxic trap meant for the greedy heirs who ruined him. But his personal non-estate asset, a $10 million life insurance policy, clean, non-probate and protected from federal liens, had been routed directly into a private account under my name in Switzerland 6 months ago. I stepped into the mirrored elevator cab, watching the doors slide shut, sealing the ruins of the Vance Empire on the 52nd floor. When I walked out into the warm New York rain, the heavy summer air tasted clean. The weight was gone. The justice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. If you were standing in that room today watching the people who tore your life apart lose everything to their own greed, would you have stayed to watch them weep, or would you have walked away into the rain like I did? Leave your thoughts below, and subscribe for more chapters of justice.